What were the consequences of the end of World War II in Europe 80 years ago this week? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners as always.
Yeah, okay, Richard, we're going to discuss today something that you and I were writing about, gosh, in the early days of the Future of Freedom Foundation, especially in our book, The Failure of America's Foreign Wars, that we co-edited, but mostly it was you doing the editing. And in that book, we addressed various foreign wars, I think probably all of them that the U.S. is engaged in. But we had a lot of essays on World War II. And May 8th is the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the ending of World War II, when the Nazi machine surrendered. Hitler had committed suicide, and shortly thereafter was the surrender. So I thought we ought to discuss World War II, the so-called good war. Now, what's interesting, discussing this war, the good war, as they called it, that generation, now as compared to back when we were starting FFF in the 1990s, is that almost all the people that fought in that war are now dead. I mean, back then, 30 years ago, when we would talk about World War II as not being the so-called good war that it was made out to be, we'd get attacked by all the veterans of World War II. And now those veterans are pretty much gone. So we can criticize World War II in peace. So let me just start out the show by discussing two aspects of it, and that is the beginning of World War II and then the end of World War II. The beginning, of course, is sordid. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted America to get into that war. The American people were overwhelmingly opposed to it. They knew what had happened with World War I, a total disaster, total waste of American life, and had really just given rise to World War II, which was essentially a continuation of World War I. But Roosevelt figured out a way to circumvent the will of the American people. At this time, they were still following the declaration of war requirement in the Constitution. The presidents were. And so Roosevelt puts this squeeze on Japan. Germany refused to take his bait. He tried to put the squeeze on them in the hope that Germany would attack U.S. ships in the Atlantic, and Germany just didn't take the bait. They saw exactly what he was doing, but his strategy was very effective with respect to Japan. He had this oil embargo that put the squeeze on them, freezing their assets, delivering humiliating negotiating terms to them that he knew they would find humiliating and reject. And so finally, the Japanese, being squeezed because they needed that oil for their war machine in China, try to knock out the America's Pacific Fleet there at Pearl Harbor. And Roosevelt got what he wanted. He got the war with Japan, and then Germany declares war, and he's now in the European conflict, which is what he wanted. So it was a sordid way to get into the war in contravention to what the will of the American people was, because now it was easy to get his declaration of war. He says, "Oh, we've been attacked, and now you have no choice but to give me my declaration of war." And sure enough, he got it. So now if we jump to the end of the war, or if we stay there at the beginning of the war, the war was launched really by Great Britain. When Great Britain declares war on Germany because of its invasion of Poland, and Great Britain vows to free the Polish people. That was the ostensible reason for entering the war, because of this guarantee that they had given the Poles. So if we jump to the end of the war, what's the end of the war? Okay, yeah, the Nazis are defeated after a vast loss of life, massive destruction throughout Europe, throughout Russia, and the people in Eastern Europe are freed of Nazi tyranny, but the irony is that now they're under communist tyranny, thanks to what Roosevelt had done at these war conferences and post-war conferences. He'd essentially given the Eastern Europeans to the Soviet communists, who were, interestingly enough, America's partner and ally. So what kind of victory is that? The aftermath of the war, the people that you're vowing to free are, okay, yeah, free of Nazi tyranny, but now under control of the communists for the next 40 some odd years. In addition to that, we end up adopting the enemy that had been Hitler's official enemy, communism. I mean, Hitler was a fierce anti-communist. He hated Russia. That becomes our official enemy. Then that's what launches the whole Cold War. That's what ends up converting the federal government to a national security state. And then we get the Korean War that comes out of this. We get the Vietnam War. We get this whole empire of foreign military bases, NATO, a legacy that we're still dealing with today, with the war on terrorism, which, of course, mirrors the war on communism in many perspectives. So my point here is that if you look at the consequences of World War II, it's not the great good war that proponents of this war often make it out to be. What do you think, Richard?
Well, let me sort of amplify and build upon some of your remarks. In the events before America's entry into the Second World War, which you were mentioning also, the fact is in the 1930s, precisely because of America's disillusionment with the outcome of the First World War, Congress signed various neutrality acts, which Franklin Roosevelt, as president, signed off on. And these neutrality acts limited the ability of the U.S. to take sides or give particular support to one side or the other. The U.S. it was meant to keep the United States out of another European war. And in spite of his signature on these, once the war in Europe breaks out, following, as you were pointing out, first the Nazi and then their partner, the Soviet invasion of Poland, which makes Poland disappear from the map of Europe, Churchill and Roosevelt get into this long secret correspondence. The upshot of it is that Churchill realizes that once there's the fall of France in June of 1940, and that Britain is standing alone, he's never going to defeat the Nazis on his own. The British do not have the military capability to undertake on their own, with their own financial resources, an invasion of the European continent and destroy the Nazi regime, as Churchill was insisting was the war aim of the British Empire. And at the same time, Roosevelt clearly abhors the Nazi regime. And on one level, of course, anybody would abhor that regime. But in the process of abhorring the Nazi regime, he viewed himself as needing to bring America into the war on the British side to assure an anti-Nazi victory. But this required him to use methods of subterfuge and secrecy. The reason being is that in one public opinion poll after another, right up until virtually just before the last opinion polls before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, large majorities, huge majorities of Americans in these public opinion polls, 80%, 85%, would say that yes, they had sympathy for the British and they did not necessarily have any sympathy for Hitler, but they did not want America to be participating in the war in Europe. So Roosevelt, facing these types of opinion poll numbers, and himself in the autumn of 1940, running for an unprecedented third term for the White House, basically lied to the American people. Going into that third election in the autumn of 1940, he was campaigning and saying, "I've said it once and I'll say it again. I hate war, and I will say that American boys never fight again on foreign shores." All the time that he's in negotiations in these secret correspondences with Winston Churchill to see that he'll do all in his power to assure war material, financial support as the British are drawing down their own empire financial resources to continue their fight. and that the ultimate goal would be a British and American alliance uh, where their forces would fight together to bring about the end of the Nazi regime. So the entire America's entry into the war is enveloped in lies, deceit, misinformation, fake news on the part of the Roosevelt administration leading up to all of those events. And then, as you were saying correctly, is that the battleship Greer, the U.S. battleship Greer in the Atlantic, got into a minor shooting war with a German submarine in the North Atlantic. The Greer had been tracking a German submarine, a U-boat, and had been informing the British where the U-boat was to basically set up the U-boat for the British to attack. And finally, being tracked like this, hunted down like this, the U-boat turned around and fired a torpedo at the Greer. It missed the Greer. But the president, you see, we have come under attack. We're an innocent, neutral power. We're just minding our own business, just tootling around in the North Atlantic Sea, and they're shooting at us. But it wasn't enough to arouse indignity and support for a declaration of war at that time. So instead, as you were saying, he used a sort of as some historians have called it, a backdoor to war. Uh, he disliked the Japanese very much. Uh, and he then undertook these sanctions, as you were saying, embargoes, basically freezing Japanese access to various raw materials, including oil, steel, from the U.S. market, and then pressured the Dutch, who were the colonial power in what today we call Indonesia, not to sell them oil. And as you were saying, we basically pushed the Japanese into a corner that they either conceded to all American demands, and that demand was basically for the Japanese to 100% withdraw from all Chinese territory they had occupied since 1937, um, or the U.S. would continue to put this squeeze on. So they were put into a corner, and they decided that they were not going to give in. And by being pushed into a corner, they therefore resulted in their plan for attacking Pearl Harbor, um, uh, heavily disabling the American fleet in Honolulu, and therefore hoping to be able to conquer Southeast Asia by sort of neutralizing the U.S. militarily. And then it would be a fait accompli, which the Americans would have to accept. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. But that was basically Roosevelt's other way of sort of getting America involved in this war. And then giving priority, once 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States, giving priority to the campaign against Hitler in Europe and not the Japanese in the Pacific. Now, again, I'll just do what you did, which was fast forward to the end of the war. Uh, Franklin Roosevelt liked Joseph Stalin. He met him twice. First at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Tehran, Iran, and the second one at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. And at both of these conferences, this was his first to-face meetings with Stalin, and he basically wanted to do anything to curry favor, to be his buddy. To just give a couple of examples, um, Stalin was insisting that as part of the war settlements, when the Allies would be victorious, uh, everything that he had gained from his secret pact with Hitler in 1939 would have to be recognized as rightly Soviet territory. And this included the three little Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which the Soviets had invaded and annexed in June of 1940 as the Germans were just finishing their conquest of France in Western Europe. And so at the Tehran conference, Roosevelt was saying, well, I have no problem with this because I know that if there were to be a democratic election, notice how he phrased that, if there were, meaning he wasn't asking for one. If there were a democratic election, I know the Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians would want to be part of the Soviet Union anyway. So why bother even asking for a democratic election? But then he said, but we have to keep this secret because I'm going to be running for re-election for the fourth term in 1944, and I need the Polish and Lithuanian vote in Chicago. Okay. So when he came back from the Tehran conference, he told his medical doctor, because obviously people around Roosevelt wrote their reminiscences after Roosevelt's death, that he told his doctor, you know, I like Stalin. He's the whole works. Uh, he doesn't deal with the Congress. He doesn't deal with any opposition. You make a deal with him, and that's it. I like it. He's the whole works. Like, gee, if only I could have that kind of absolute unqualified power. And then the other thing is that then at the Yalta conference, uh, he basically accedes to all of Stalin's demands again, even nominally. Eastern Europe will basically be under Soviet sphere of influence, a green light to set up puppet governments. And so he comes back from that conference, and he's in Washington. He's informing his cabinet members how the Yalta conference has gone. And he told us this isn't a transcript from a cabinet meeting. Okay, you know something? Every time I meet Stalin, I like him more. There's something of the Christian gentleman in him. The Christian gentleman? This is the guy who killed 20 million Soviet citizens, starved them to death in the forced collectivization of the land, rounded them up in the tens of millions to send them off to be slave labor and die in the gulag, to have purges in which millions more were just executed on trumped up charges due to Stalin's constant paranoia of enemies everywhere. I mean, and this is the Christian gentleman who he just likes every time he meets. So this is the situation that Europe was left in. Yes, were the French happy to be freed from the Germans? Of course. The Dutch, the Belgians, the Norwegians, the Danes, of course. Even the Italians were glad to see Mussolini gone, obviously. But as far as the Eastern European countries, those three Baltic republics, and then Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and what became the Eastern Soviet zone part of Germany, what became the East Germany, the German Democratic Communist Republic. Were these areas free from tyranny? Were they liberated from the hand of a totalitarian tyrant? Were they allowed to develop as normal societies with rule of law, civil liberties, degrees of economic freedom? At least to the same degree that was existing in Western Europe? Of course not. For another almost half a century, they were on the iron fist of communist puppet regimes that did exactly what Moscow told them to do. But that's the world that set the stage for the Cold War. Because then, oh, Stalin is a tyrant. He's setting up all these communist regimes in Eastern Europe. We're shocked. We're shocked. What? He's a Christian gentleman. And that becomes the ground in 1949 for the founding of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, meant to be a defensive alliance of Western powers, including what was then becoming the renewed independent West Germany, as a buffer to prevent a feared Soviet invasion of Western Europe, which really the Soviets never intended and didn't even have the power to do so. Even Stalin didn't plan that. If I can just give one more story, as the Second World War was ending, and after the Yalta Conference, a delegation of Yugoslav communists came to Moscow to meet with Stalin. And Stalin said that he explained that wherever an army ends, that's where it establishes its own political system. Well, here he had just given mouth promises at Yalta. Oh, yeah, maybe democratic elections. But he's now telling the Yugoslavians, what democratic elections? Where my army stops, that's where communism sits. And then he says, we've been exhausted by the war. But you know what? We'll rebuild, and in 20 years, we'll have another go at it. And that's all recounted by Milovan Dijlas, who was a leading Yugoslav communist who fell out with Tito after the war. But anyway, but this was the situation. The Soviets didn't have the capacity to start another war for even in Stalin's view for another 20 years, which would then be what 1965 in his own mind. Of course, he died in 1953. So this idea that the world was eminently threatened was a joke and was based upon a president who wanted to remake the world in his image of a global New Deal in alliance with a tyrant who basically said one other thing. He also said to these Yugoslav communists, when you meet when you meet with Churchill, he's trying to pick your pocket for a kopeck. A kopeck is a Russian version of a penny, right? He's trying to pick your pocket for a kopeck. Roosevelt, he deeper into your pocket. He's trying to steal everything. So you see, here Roosevelt is thinking, I'm just trying to, ingratiate myself to Comrade Stalin. He'll work with me for world peace after the war. And what Stalin's, why is Roosevelt being so nice? He must be planning something sneaky. So this is the mentality that Roosevelt was trying to make a new world for, which just set the stage for everything that has happened since then in terms of the Cold War. Threats of a nuclear war has happened in 1962, and the unending regional wars, Korea, Vietnam, and so on, and American attempts to overthrow supposed communists in various third world countries during the entire Cold War era, which resulted, as well as you were saying, the militarization of American society because of the paranoia and the fear that you need to have an all-powerful military and a surveillance state to assure the supposed threats facing American security.
Yeah, well, you've raised a lot of good points. You mentioned something interesting that when Hitler invades Poland, which brings in the British, it says because they had issued this guarantee, that at the very same time you pointed out, the Soviet Union, or a few days later, invade Poland too.
Yes.
Well, why then doesn't Great Britain declare war on the Soviet Union? Why only on Germany? I mean, it was just really strange because you've got the moral equivalent here, the immoral equivalent of two totalitarian regimes that are carving up this independent country. Um, and when Great Britain issues this guarantee to come to Poland's aid, they knew right at the moment that they issued that guarantee they could never honor it. As you pointed out, they knew they lacked the military might to free the Poles from German tyranny. And the problem is that by issuing that guarantee, they thought that they would deter Germany, Hitler, from invading Poland. But the minute they issue that guarantee, that emboldens these Polish officials, which ordinarily would have been required to negotiate with Hitler, because Hitler's complaints had some justification. I mean, people had talked about the unjust Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler had seized upon the unjust provisions of that treaty that had settled World War One. And part of this was demanding this corridor through Poland to reach this city that had been taken away from Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. I forget the name of it, but it was separate and apart now as a result of this treaty. So Hitler's there saying, well, give us a corridor through here so we can reach it on land. And Poland, once they get the guarantee, are under no incentive to negotiate. Now, it's very possible that Hitler would have ended up taking over Poland anyway. It was clear that he was going to war against the Soviet Union at some point or another. But once Poland got that guarantee from Great Britain, that was it. They said, we don't need to negotiate anymore, which then, of course, leads to the war. Then at the end of the war, another point you were making is how they come up with the NATO and this whole mindset that, oh, we've got to protect Western Europe from the Soviets. The Soviet Union had been devastated in World War II, unlike the United States. Even England had not been invaded. I mean, total devastation. The Russians had almost made it all the way to the point where they were going to exact a surrender from the Soviets. It was at the last minute because of the Russian winter that the Germans started to get defeated and had to turn around. But tens of millions of people dead, their industrial might destroyed. What are the chances that the Soviets are thinking about invading Western Europe at this point? They were non-existent. They were very happy with this huge buffer that they now had against a future Nazi Germany. They had all of Eastern Europe as a buffer that they controlled. They had half of Germany that they controlled now. They were very happy with that kind of, that's a large buffer against another invasion. what was really going on was that the United States, the national security establishment was coming into existence. They built the Pentagon in the middle of World War II. That was not going to be a temporary edifice. They were already planning for this massive military establishment, intelligence establishment in the United States, which fundamentally altered the American way of life from a limited government republic to a national security state, which was the same type of totalitarian system that the Soviets had, with omnipotent powers, state sponsored assassinations, torture, indefinite detention that we're still living with today. But they knew that in order to achieve that, Richard, they needed official enemies and they needed fear. Fear is the core of the realm in any national security state. So the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. You know, the chances that Russia would invade Western Europe were non-existent, especially since they knew that they'd be facing the United States, which was the only power that had nuclear weapons and was very willing to use them against populated cities, as demonstrated with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What the U.S. needed was, and the West needed, was official enemies that they could be used to frighten the American people into going along with this brand new, what Eisenhower would later call military industrial complex that is really the biggest threat to our freedom and well-being, as Eisenhower pointed out.
Well, as the reason we ended up talking about this today is that May 8th will mark the 80th anniversary of the uh, surrender of Nazi Germany in Europe. And many of those who fought in that war, if not well, practically all of those who fought in the war, have either passed away or are approaching those advanced ages in which they will no longer be with us. In fact, this morning, uh, uh, I was watching BBC News, and they're, of course, having a huge, today, we're having a huge parades and celebrations in London marking the British victory over Germany. And symbolizing this was one of their World War II soldiers representing those who were still alive. He's 100 years old. He's 100 years old. So this celebration is basically marking virtually the end of the generation that has a living memory of experience in that war. Uh, and you have to then say, is that, well, what is the war's lasting significance? Uh, and it's not to question at the time the belief of the ordinary people who participated in the British Army or the American Army, their belief that they were doing something heroic or necessary. That's not the issue. And men do brave things in wars that they're put into, whether it's a just war or not. And as individuals, you do not criticize them or condemn them or humiliate them. They're just following often just what governments have told them tragically. And innocent men are put in the position to do tragic things and are just trying to be good people at the time, fighting, quote, for their side. But it doesn't change the fact, it doesn't change the fact that governments set this war in motion. And while certainly the Nazi regime was despicable, Stalin's regime had even more blood on its hands. Uh, the British government, the US government, they also had their motives and ambitions of political power, international diplomacy, military positioning. When Churchill spoke about defeating the Nazis, he of course about Britain as the land of freedom and Magna Carta, but he also would emphasize preserving and saving the British Empire, the British Empire. This is the idea that this war had to be won to assure Britain's domination of the world in what was then its world encompassing empire with so many colonies in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and so on. And for the United States, this was Roosevelt's notion of giving the world the New Deal that he had attempted to impose upon the United States domestically in the 1930s. A New Deal of government control, government planning, government regulation, government overreach, government domination of society, which is what the United Nations was supposed to do. Remember, it has a Security Council with 5 permanent members. And in Roosevelt's mind, It was the duty and the responsibility of the United States, Britain, France, Soviet Russia, and China to police the world and to have veto and on that anything that would challenge their role and their perspectives in this. So basically, it was an attempt to divide up the world, it being dominated by a handful of powers that were viewed as the victors in the conflict. And instead of the other side dominating the world, these five were to do so. And that too is part of the legacy that that war that ended in Europe on May 8th represents.
Yeah, well, you mentioned these celebrations. I'm fairly confident that the Polish people and the Czechs and the Slovaks and the rest of them are not going to be celebrating this great victory over the Nazis. And the reason I say that is that some years ago, U.S. officials went over to Eastern Europe to have one of these kind of celebrations, I don't know, D-Day or something like that. And the answer of the Poles was, why should we be celebrating this? This wasn't any great victory for us. Sure, you knocked out the Nazis, but look what you left us. You left us next 45 years or so under communist control. And who's to say that the communists were any better than the Nazis? So it really goes to show you that the sordid aspect of this war, that we're partnering with this horrific, monstrous dictatorial regime to destroy another dictatorial regime. And it's impossible to say what would have happened if the US had not intervened, of course. But the probability is it's not this thing, oh, the Nazis would have taken over the world. They were dead set on conquering the world. They couldn't even successfully cross the English Channel to invade England. That what most likely would have happened, and you pointed this out many years ago in an article for FFF, that there would have been a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany was always moving eastward, and they let them fight it out. At the end of that war, they both would have been extremely weakened. Whoever lost would be destroyed, but whoever won was going to be extremely weakened. The Western powers would have been significantly strengthened by avoiding the war. And it would have been a much more beneficial outcome for the United States and the British people and the French people if that had been the case.
Yes, and on May 9th, which is the official day that in the Soviet and now Russian view of things, the war ended, because that's when the Nazis surrendered to Soviet generals. They're going to have a big parade in Moscow, marking this 80th anniversary. They're even having foreign representatives coming. I mean, leading foreign leaders like Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and Xi Jinping from China. Now, why is this such a basis of celebration for this in Russia? Well, it's not only that they succeeded in defeating the Nazi invaders, who did kill well over 20 million Soviets in their war in the East. But the fact is that when the war ended on May 8th, May 9th, as the Russians view the date, the Soviet army was halfway through Europe. It was in the heart of Europe. It had conquered Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, Berlin. And in fact, to show you how nothing could make Stalin happy, at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, now Stalin meeting with Truman, Truman went up to Stalin and congratulated him on the Soviet army succeeding in their victory over the Nazis and their conquest of Berlin. What was Stalin's reply? Tsar Alexander reached Paris. That was in the war against Napoleon. Damn it. I wanted Paris too. But as far as the Russians are concerned, it gave them their post-war empire out of in the ashes of their victory over the Nazis. So why wouldn't Putin be celebrating?
Yeah,
Because what he would
absolutely.
like to see is a return to that if he could get away with it.
Okay, on that insightful note, we'll wrap things up. As always, I greatly enjoyed the visit. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like to support the FFF, send us a donation through our website at fff.org. Thank you for the great support you all have been giving us and have given us for the last 35 years. Richard, as always, I enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.